The story of Japan's phantom worker rings did not begin with a crime, or even with a conscious decision. It began with avoidance, and with something far more human. As the old saying goes, the path to hell is paved with good intentions, and nowhere did that prove more true than in offices where kindness, silence, and the desire to preserve harmony quietly became instruments of fraud. A name was left untouched on a payroll list, a form was placed at the bottom of a stack, a conversation was postponed because no one wanted to be the one who shattered the calm. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Japan was still living inside the long aftershock of economic collapse. The bubble had burst years earlier, but its consequences were slow, grinding, and deeply personal. Companies failed without spectacle. Hiring froze. Promotions stalled. Men and women raised to believe in lifetime employment found themselves trapped in roles that no longer existed in spirit or quietly pushed out of them altogether. Yet the social expectations surrounding work did not soften. Employment remained proof of worth, reliability, and moral standing. To lose it was not merely to lose income, it was to risk becoming socially invisible. Within this pressure cooker, institutions learned to protect appearances at almost any cost. Municipal offices, subcontractors, cleaning firms, maintenance teams, places where oversight was light and paperwork reigned supreme, became fertile ground for quiet distortions. These were not glamorous workplaces. They were fluorescent-lit rooms with rows of metal desks, calendars pinned to walls, thermoses of tea beside stacks of files. The aim, at least at first, was not enrichment. It was continuity, calm, the illusion that nothing fundamental had broken. It often started with a single person. Someone retired early. Someone stopped coming in because of illness. Someone quietly resigned after burnout or a family crisis. Sometimes, someone died. The correct procedure was clear: notify payroll, update records, adjust budgets, inform superiors. But the consequences of doing so were never merely administrative. Questions followed, and questions carried risk. Why was the position empty? Why had it not been refilled? Where would the unused funds go? Would staffing levels be reduced? Would next year's budget be cut? Would someone higher up begin asking why this department suddenly appeared to need less money? Every answer threatened stability. So a clerk delayed filing, a supervisor said nothing, a name stayed where it was, the salary continued to be paid, often into an existing bank account. At first this felt temporary, a month or two while things were sorted out, a kindness while a widow adjusted, a buffer while a department found its footing. No one framed it as wrongdoing, it was framed as patience, compassion, practicality. And nothing happened. The system did not object. The forms were stamped, the numbers balanced. No alarms sounded. Absence was invisible because absence was not something the system was designed to detect. In Japan's bureaucratic culture, paperwork carries a peculiar authority. A stamped document is treated as reality itself. Physical presence becomes secondary. Attendance is assumed. Absence can always be explained later, if it ever needs explaining at all. Questioning a superior's records is not diligence, it is disruption. Social harmony is preserved through silence far more often than confrontation, and so silence prevailed. As weeks turned into months, the arrangement stopped feeling temporary. It became routine. The money, meanwhile, found uses. In some offices it flowed into informal funds. Overtime that could not officially be claimed was quietly compensated. Budget shortfalls were patched. After-hours obligations, farewell dinners, condolence gifts, seasonal gatherings were paid for without troubling official accounts. Participants told themselves they were not stealing. They were redistributing. They were protecting the group, ensuring no one was singled out, no department embarrassed, no superior inconvenienced. In other cases, the money flowed outward, into homes where survival depended on it. Families of deceased workers were among the earliest beneficiaries. Reporting a death triggered a bureaucratic avalanche. Pensions recalculated, benefits reduced, housing reassessed, taxes adjusted. For elderly spouses or adult children who had never worked outside the family structure, this could mean immediate poverty. Shame compounded fear. To admit dependence was to admit failure, and failure was not something Japanese society handled gently. So a supervisor delayed paperwork. A clerk looked the other way. A salary arrived again the next month. Relief followed. Gratitude. Silence hardened into habit. Those families learned to live carefully. They avoided attention. They did not move. They did not travel. They spent only on necessities: rent, utilities, food, medical care. The money was not luxury, it was oxygen. Many lived with constant anxiety, listening for the sound of the postman's footsteps, fearing official envelopes, rehearsing explanations they would never give. Not all phantom workers were dead. Some were still alive, suspended in a strange half-existence. Illness, depression, or exhaustion had driven them away from work years earlier. Returning would mean admitting weakness. Explaining absence would mean confronting superiors and colleagues who had quietly covered for them. Shame kept them away. Fear kept them silent. Their salary arrived each month, tying them to an arrangement they neither fully controlled nor knew how to escape. They survived, but invisibly. As years passed, the practice spread. Supervisors inherited phantom names from predecessors and chose not to disturb them. Removing a name meant exposing not just the present arrangement, but past negligence. In some departments, several such names existed at once. Their salaries were pooled into accounts controlled by a small inner circle. The longer it continued, the harder it became to stop. Ending it would require admitting that it had existed at all, and admission threatened everyone. Eventually, some took the next step. Entirely fictitious employees were created, names that had never belonged to anyone. They were assigned employee numbers, tax withholdings, pension contributions. Because money flowed through every system at every checkpoint, the systems validated one another. Payroll confirmed pensions, pensions confirmed tax, tax confirmed payroll. The illusion became airtight. These invented ghosts were the most profitable and the most dangerous. They lacked the moral ambiguity of supporting a widow or shielding a sick worker. They existed purely to absorb money no one wanted to explain. Yet even here, the motivation was often fear rather than greed. Departments were expected to maintain staffing levels regardless of budget cuts. Empty positions risked permanent elimination. Phantom workers kept numbers stable. They preserved the fiction of normalcy. For years, sometimes decades, the system functioned. And then friction arrived. Friction arrived quietly, the way it always does in Japan, not with outrage but with cross-checks. Databases that had once lived in isolation began communicating. Pension systems were matched against resident registries. Auditors noticed anomalies, employees who had never aged, never transferred, never taken leave. Names that appeared everywhere and nowhere at once. Sometimes exposure began mundanely. A bank requested updated identification. A pension notice bounced back. A junior employee, new, less invested in inherited silence, sent an anonymous letter. Occasionally a death triggered scrutiny that could not be contained. Once prosecutors became involved, the transition from silence to exposure was brutal. Investigations began with paper. Payroll lists were laid beside pension records, tax filings, residency data, and bank statements. What had once appeared coherent in isolation collapsed when compared side by side. Patterns emerged quickly. Salaries that flowed year after year without leave requests, medical claims, promotions, or evaluations. People who existed fully on paper and nowhere else. Police financial crimes units traced the money. They found layered arrangements, salaries deposited into accounts controlled by supervisors, joint signatories added quietly years earlier, transfers routed through office welfare accounts before settling into personal use. In family cases, spending told a quieter story. No luxury, no excess, just survival. Rent paid on time. Utilities settled monthly. Medical bills covered without delay. Interrogations were restrained but relentless. Prosecutors returned to the same timelines again and again until contradictions surfaced. Many did not break out of fear of prison, but out of exhaustion and shame. "I didn't know how to stop" became a refrain. It was already there when I arrived. If I had spoken up, everything would have collapsed. Indictments were carefully tiered. Junior clerks who had merely processed paperwork were often treated as witnesses. Those who had actively maintained or expanded the schemes faced charges of fraud, breach of trust, and falsification of official records. In public sector cases, misuse of public funds carried particular weight. Court proceedings were quiet, almost clinical. Judges showed little tolerance for arguments about tradition or inherited practice, but sentencing reflected nuance. Organizers of long-running rings often received suspended prison terms or short custodial sentences, along with repayment orders stretching back years. The true punishment lay elsewhere. Dismissal from public service was immediate and permanent. Careers ended overnight. Pensions were reduced or erased. Re-employment was nearly impossible. In a society where professional identity is inseparable from personal worth, this amounted to social erasure. For families who had depended on phantom salaries, exposure was catastrophic. Incomes stopped immediately. Repayment demands arrived for years of wages suddenly reclassified as illegal. Stability collapsed into debt, fear, and shame. Elderly widows were forced to move in with relatives or reduce life to bare survival. Heating was rationed, meals simplified, medical visits delayed. Adult children faced a different reckoning. Many had never built formal careers, having cared for parents under the assumption of continued income. Exposure forced them into a labor market for which they were unprepared. Middle age arrived without resumes, references, or explanations that could be spoken aloud. Some withdrew entirely, disappearing from public life just as completely as the phantom workers themselves. Families fractured under strain. Arguments surfaced over responsibility. Siblings severed contact to avoid stigma. Silence spread within households, just as it had within offices. Children absorbed the fallout quietly, school fees harder to pay, moves explained vaguely, parents withdrawing from community life. Phantom workers who were still alive suffered deeply psychological consequences. Years of invisibility left many unable to re-engage with ordinary life. The loss of income compounded the loss of identity. Some described feeling as though they had died socially long before the investigation began. Society watched these cases with unease rather than outrage. Press coverage was meticulous but restrained. Newspapers reported figures and timelines with precision but avoided sensationalism. Editorials expressed disappointment rather than fury. Many acknowledged the structural pressures that had allowed the schemes to persist. Television coverage was brief, faces blurred, names often withheld. The government response was procedural. Official statements framed the scandals as administrative failures and lapses in oversight. Databases were integrated. Digital cross-checks expanded. Attendance verification became mandatory. Audits were regularized. What was absent was a reckoning with why so many people had felt safer maintaining a lie than telling the truth. Within weeks, the stories faded from headlines. Files were archived. Names were erased from payrolls. The ghosts disappeared, not just from accounts but from conversation. Yet something lingered. The phantom worker scandals unsettled Japan because they revealed a society that had quietly taught its members there was no dignified way to fail. Good intentions, kindness, loyalty, silence had paved a path that led somewhere no one had intended to go. Bureaucracy had replaced reality because reality was too painful to confront. Justice arrived in the end. It was precise, procedural, and legally correct. But it came too late to save the lives that had been quietly built around a lie no one knew how to end. And in that silence, after the files were closed and the names erased, the ghosts endured, not as entries on a payroll, but as a reminder of what happens when harmony matters more than truth.